Hi, I just wanted to jump on here and make a quick video in response to some of the comments that I got on my last video on cancel culture and canceling the left. I got some comments in particular about Jimmy Kimmel and the reactions from President Trump and the FCC and just ideas about inappropriate political pressure and coercion to get him canceled. And I want to address this because I agree with what people are saying that this is wrong, it's inappropriate, it needs to be called out. I want to also just look at the larger context because there was one comment, Ty Cobb, he was talking about how the pressure the Trump administration put on ABC was comparable to what happened in Nazi Germany. I think there are some important distinctions there that I want to get into, but there were some other comments that I indeed agree were inappropriate. For example, FCC Chairman Brendan Carr saying these companies can find ways to change conduct to take action on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead. That sounds like political coercion. Trump's comments about how he said, okay, let me read this quote to you. I have read someplace that the networks were 97% against me. Again, 97% negative. And yet I won and easily all 7 swing states. And then he was saying it as a way to address this media bias. I would think maybe their license should be taken away. And okay, I see how that is analogous to Hitler trying to control the media and propaganda, but again, some distinctions that I'm going to get into later. And then finally, there was the mention of the DOJ scrubbing their website of the mention of how, the majority of the far right extremists have killed far more Americans than any other domestic terrorist group. That really, I don't have anything other than that was just bad. That was wrong. That was suppressing information. There's nothing redeemable about doing that. That's just unequivocally bad. So, I want to come on here and just directly say, I do condemn inappropriate political coercion to try to get people to put stuff out that aligns with your views, and suppressing information, that is the strongest form of condemnation. Absolutely not. I don't like that. And I do want to get into, so Trump said that the networks were 97% against him. And that is just factually wrong. The statistic I found was they're not 97% against him. They're only 92%. Think about that. 92%. If you don't see why 92% negative coverage of a sitting president is a problem, I urge you to think about it. Let's say you're a viewer and you voted for Claudia De La Cruz or Jill Stein or Kamala Harris or any other candidate but Trump. Think about if that candidate had that much negative coverage and you were a supporter of that candidate. Just think about how you would feel. But having said that, I do want to say that 92% statistic was from the Media Research Center, which is a right-leaning organization. So I did a bit more research because I said, okay, well, what would something more left-leaning actually say? How accurate actually is this? And I found a study from Harvard, and this I find so illuminating. I'm going to be reading straight from my screen because I want this read word for word. The study, conducted by Professor Thomas E. Patterson of Harvard's Kennedy School and the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, found 80% of the media's coverage of President Trump during the first 100 days of his administration was negative. This is not part of the quote, but I just want to emphasize this was not during the election cycle in the run-up. This was the first 100 days of his administration, which I think is important, and I'll get to why in a minute. Getting back to the quote. Not only that, but news about President Trump and his administration consumed fully 41% of all news coverage, 3 times as much as previous administrations and coverage of presidents. Trump has complained of being targeted by the news media, and Patterson wrote, quote, "The sheer level of negative coverage gives weight to Trump's contention, one shared by his core constituency, that the media are hell-bent on destroying his presidency, end quote. Compare the numbers for Trump to those enjoyed by Barack Obama. The coverage for Obama was 59% favorable versus 41% unfavorable. Any fair-minded person will recall the media was notoriously hostile to the presidency of George W. Bush, yet during the first 100 days of the Bush administration, the news coverage was 57% negative versus 43% positive. And now we get into the specifics of the actual outlets, and this is where we're starting to see the 90% numbers. CNN and NBC averaged 93% negative coverage of Trump's first 100 days, with CBS creeping behind with 91% negative coverage. The television networks do not have a monopoly on negative coverage. The two most notable anti-Trump news outlets, the New York Times and the Washington Post, averaged 87% and 83% negative coverage, respectively. Now, I mentioned the first 100 days of Trump's presidency. Why do I think this is important? Well, I've got another quote for you. This is talking about the first few weeks following Hitler's election as chancellor on January 30th, 1933. I quote again. During the first weeks of 1933, the Nazi regime deployed the radio, press, and newsreels to stoke fears of a pending communist uprising, then channeled popular anxieties into political measures that eradicated civil liberties and democracy. SA, stormtroopers, and members of the Nazi elite paramilitary formation, the SS, took to the streets to brutalize or arrest political opponents and incarcerate them in hastily established detention centers and concentration camps. Nazi thugs broke into opposing political party offices, destroying printing presses and newspapers. End quote. No, I hope you can see why I'm saying this, but if you don't, do you think in the first 100 days there was 90+% negative coverage of Hitler? These people were coming in and they were dominating the media and pushing out their propaganda as soon as they got into office. That is markedly different from all the negative coverage of Trump that Trump was seeing and allowing. He didn't like it, but he wasn't silencing them. So I want to point out too, imagine if a school principal, this is just an analogy and it's not a perfect one, but if a school principal was trying to be in charge of a school and the teachers would talk about him to the students and the parents, and 90% of the time, what they said about the principal was negative. Now imagine the principal trying to run the school in that environment. I hope you can see why this is problematic. And let me point out too, Trump got 49.9% of the popular vote. So this messaging that the media is putting out is not aligning with American thought at all. It is radically to the left. Now, I want to bring up some more statistics. This is from Gallup polls that started, I believe, around like 1971 or something, and they would measure the trust in the news media by different political persuasions. And Republican and independent trust is at an all-time low since they started measuring this in 1970. Only 27% and 27% of independents and 12% of Republicans place a great deal or fair amount of trust in mass media. And this is compared to 54% of Democrats. And I'm adding that Democrat number in there because I do feel like if you're liberal, if you're liberal, I feel like this is just really the time, if you have your empathy, use it right now. Because if you are seeing a lot of media out there that is aligning with your views and angry at the same people you are, hating the same people you are, championing the same ideas that you are, it can be hard to recognize how other people are getting shut out. And, one of the biggest things that I've heard, I'm sorry, that's my dog in the background. One of the biggest criticisms I've heard of like how America has gotten as partisan as it is today is that people are going into these echo chambers where they're getting their news from different sources, they're listening to different people, they're not interacting with one another. And honestly, I would say this is the main contributor to it. You know, I mean, if your choices as a conservative are to listen to news that is antagonistic towards your views and encouraging you to hate your president, or to go and get your news from someone who is just openly biased, you know, like a conservative commentator or influencer or something. If those are your only choices, I hope you can understand why people would be stepping away from that commonplace area where people used to get their news from the same sources. I mean, didn't people used to gather around the radio like 100 years ago, and then they'd gather around the TV and they'd watch the same things together? And now it's very hard to do that. Another thing that I want to bring up is Gina Carano. If you've heard of her, a political commentator, Clay Travis, was mentioning how in 2021, Gina Carano had the most popular show on streaming when she shared a social media post and was immediately fired by Disney. And in the social media post, Carano had said, quote, "Because history is edited, most people today don't realize that to get to the point where Nazi soldiers could easily round up thousands of Jews, the government first made their own neighbors hate them simply for being Jewish. How is that any different from hating someone for their political views?" End quote. And what I want to mention was that Gina was fired by Disney. As far as I know, there was no intervention from the FCC. She was just fired. And I just find it an interesting thought experiment. Oh, before I do that, I do want to mention this commentator, what was his name? Clay Travis. He was not saying this as a reason to fire Jimmy Kimmel. He was more saying this as he doesn't think Jimmy Kimmel should have been fired, and he also thinks that Gina Carano shouldn't have been fired, that she deserves an apology, and that the way forward is to have just more allowance for people expressing these different views, which I think is a very admirable and non-hypocritical way to go about it. But okay, so to get back to the thought experiment, I do just want to hear from people who were objecting to this and was saying that, you know, Jimmy Kimmel did nothing wrong, he shouldn't have been fired. You know, let's say, for the sake of argument, the only reason that Jimmy Kimmel was fired was because of this pressure from Trump and the FCC. And if it weren't for that, he would not have been fired. If that is what happened, and we were instead in an environment where conservatives are getting fired for expressing their views and would continue to get fired to express their views, and liberals would not be getting fired for the same, even if on either side their views were somewhat antagonistic and contentious and people found offensive, how would you handle that? You know, how would you actually like acknowledge and address the double standard that's out there? Because I mean, the thing is, like, Trump's going about this the wrong way, okay? Like, let's be clear about this. Like, yeah, like, if you're trying to take away people's licenses, then that is the government censoring free speech. It goes against the First Amendment. It's pretty clear. But there is a part of me that's like, you know what? Like, at least someone's finally addressing this, even if it is the wrong way to do it. And if we want to address it, but address it the right way, how do we do it? You know, I mean, I've seen people, most of what I've seen online the past couple weeks have been a lot of anger, a lot of passion and emotion. I have seen a few people just saying like, hey, we need unity now more than ever. And the few posts that I've seen that, I don't feel like they've really taken the next step of saying like, okay, well, what does unity look like? What actions does that mean taking? And in my opinion, unity is not about silencing one side and then equally silencing the other one. It's about creating an environment where people don't feel the need to be silenced. And part of that is an environment where the news that you're getting from mainstream media is more closely aligned to American values.